Welcome to today's situation report. We are talking about the war in Ukraine, what has happened at the front and everything related to it, and certainly a few important reports from there. On the one hand, the Ukrainians have been largely successful with their counterattacks in Kupyansk. In recent weeks, I have repeatedly reported that the Ukrainians say they are currently advancing, but I have lacked any evidence. This has now been confirmed, because now even the Russian mill bloggers are admitting that the Russians have had significant problems in Kupyansk and that the Ukrainians have been successful with counterattacks. We want to discuss that and other topics, for example. According to the Ukrainian side, the Sapsan has now been deployed. That means we have the ballistic missiles, also known as RIM-2, which Ukraine has developed. They are ready for mass production and likely already in use. We want to talk about that as well, and as you can imagine, there are plenty of other things too. As always, all of this here in the situation report, but let's start with the situation report. Heiliger Stroh says, save the most at Holy now with my code. Another Ukrainian attack. An oil field in the Caspian Sea was attacked. According to Ukraine, 20 oil and gas wells had to stop production because of this attack. That means there are now attacks even in the Caspian Sea. That is that I've been occupied. I've already dealt with the code before. Most of the time it's this Passover abroad that keeps us busy. For us, with them in 2020. We now turn to developments along the front, where we begin. In Sumy, I don't have any new changes that I can document. So we move on to Vovchansk, and in Vovchansk the Russians have advanced further. We have Kostyantin Marshovich, who says here that the Russians have taken over the school, which is here. So they have now crossed the Vovcha and have also advanced south into the center. The pro-Ukrainian deep state map now shows this area as fully controlled by the Russians. Here is the school. That means it goes a bit further than what Kostyantin Marshovich admits. The Russians are definitely advancing in Vovchansk and are not too far from getting the city into their hands. That's it from Vovchansk. We move on to Veliki Boluk, no change there, and in Kupyansk. As you can see, the map is largely colored blue with smaller red positions. This means Ukrainians have fully liberated the area. That area is contested, and these here are established Russian positions, which are, however, cut off. We have a few geolocations for this, so we can see Ukrainians at this point in Kupyansk, and we can see them operating in the south. We have geolocated the other position from Russians who are still in this area. As noted, the Ukrainians have operated north of them. The Ukrainians say they have now encircled 200 Russian soldiers in Kupyansk. That is, as I said, the statement from the Ukrainians. But what is remarkable is that we have Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who is making a selfie video here on the outskirts of Kupyansk, showing that he was on site. The whole thing is, of course, impressive because it means he appeared in the immediate vicinity of the front. The whole thing has been geolocated to exactly this position, and this is an area where the Russians are still present. Here, these are the buildings. This is where Zelensky made the recording. That means if we believe the deep state map, he was 1 kilometer away from Russian positions at that time. He was in the immediate vicinity, and as far as I remember, you can also hear the artillery fire in the video. If he's in the background, he's nearby. When did I dismiss that? He walked in the immediate vicinity of the Russian positions here. We have Russian mill bloggers commenting on this, Reba, probably the biggest and most influential. They write in big letters that they feared something like this, that declaring they had taken Kupyansk was premature. They suspect that the footage is from an archive and that Zelensky wasn't actually there. We must not forget that, of course, we can't expect Putin to get anywhere near as close to the front. And here we have military informant who clearly says that this is an authentic recording. Since the last recording, the condition of the steel has clearly deteriorated. And if we look at what he mentions here, we can also see that there are now fences here, the first-person view drone fences to protect the roads. That's also a relatively recent development. That means the Russian side is saying that the footage is authentic, even if it might not have been released on the exact day it was recorded. We have a few recordings here with some comments from Kirill Fedorov. The Russian mill blogger says, just as a reminder, Gerasimov and the Zapad group commander announced the city's complete liberation and the encirclement of up to 15 million Ukrainian armed forces battalions. That means it's mentioned here how the misinformation was spread by the Russian side, and once again military informant addresses this. He says the enemy took advantage of the insufficient entrenchment of the Russian armed forces in the city against the backdrop of triumphant reports about its complete capture and launched a counterattack. The Ukrainian armed forces first recaptured several high-rise buildings in the Jubilini district on the city's southwest edge. Those are the buildings I showed you. As a result, Ukrainian assault troops successfully advanced into the northwestern suburbs of Kupyansk and the villages of Moskovka and Radkivka. A similar situation had already occurred in the spring of 2025 in Torez, when the part of the city that remained under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces was declared liberated on credit. As a result, active attacks on the enemy were stopped. Afterward, the Ukrainian armed forces launched successful counterattacks, pushing Russian forces out of many city positions. As a result, the fighting in Torez continued for months after the official statements about its capture. A vivid example of what happens when you have to pay a high price for victorious reports on credit. That fits with what the Russians are saying here. The Russian Ministry of Defense declares that they have taken Kurylyvka. I also have no evidence for that. Kurylyvka is down here, so it's quite far from what we last knew as the front line. Because while the Russians say they've taken Kurylyvka, we recently had Ukrainian geolocations here up to this area. Here, Ukrainians have been active everywhere there. That means it's extremely unlikely that the Russians have taken Kurylyvka at this point. There is no evidence, no geolocation, and that matches the others. Because we have to be clear at this point, lies have consequences when a commander on the ground, for whatever reason, reports a capture. And Russian mill bloggers are annoyed that the general in charge of Access was named a hero of Russia after he reported the capture of Kupyansk. When such successes are reported that aren't real, it must be understood that resources are then reallocated as a result. If I claim that I've captured Kupyansk, then I can't. 3 days later, I can't go to the Air Force asking for heavy glide bomb strikes and say, please destroy these or those buildings for me. Because I've already captured the city if I have artillery on site and have 5 batteries. Glide bomb strikes, time frame for justification is... And if it's not known that false information was spread here, then it leads to consequences as if it had been a successful attack. That weakens Russian positions, which is why Russian mill bloggers are upset, saying it has real consequences, and we can see that right here. The Russians had declared Kupyansk as captured, but I haven't seen any evidence that the Russians have even established themselves on the eastern edge. The last Russian positions here were in the summer, when they broke through once and were able to hold out in the eastern city center for several days. Since then, I haven't seen any evidence of Russians on the eastern side of Kupyansk at all. However, it was reported as fully captured, which is clearly misleading. That now has consequences. The Ukrainians will probably be able to wipe out the Russian positions here. We must recognize the situation was very tough for the Russians. They had to cross the river. They don't have a permanent bridge connection. At least those are the latest reports, that they kept trying to build pontoon bridges but kept failing. That means they were. In the summer, people swam across the river or had to cross with small inflatable boats, which put them in great danger. In winter, swimming across likely won't be possible due to the temperatures. Another connection was a gas pipeline, and it is supposedly no longer usable, probably mined or destroyed in some other way. This makes it much harder for Russians to send supplies, which helps the Ukrainians, because the supply lines, the connection lines to the western part of Kupyansk, were heavily contested and very problematic from the beginning. 2 or 3 months ago, I told you about an attack on Huljapole, which ended in a bloody failure at the time, a Ukrainian attack in the direction of Huljapole. But that just showed that the Ukrainian side was indeed pursuing the intention of cutting off and destroying the Russian troops in Kupyansk. And it seems they are just about to do that. One of the reasons for this is probably the false report from the Russian side. That's all from Kupyansk. From the direction of Borowa and Lumen, I haven't seen any changes. I don't see anything here. On the Russian side, the capture of Lumen is sometimes already being reported. I don't see any evidence of that, except that individual Russian soldiers show up on the very eastern edge of the city every few weeks, probably through infiltration. We move on to Seversk, and things look a bit different there. The Russians claim that Seversk has fallen, and if we look at the geolocations, let's take a look. The latest ones are basically spread across the entire city area. If we look at that, we have them here, here, here in the south, and the last one here. That means it's possible that Seversk has been captured by the Russians. In that case, it was probably just 2 Russian soldiers who kept showing their flag. So it could also be an infiltration, but we have to be clear, if 2 soldiers can walk across Seversk and keep showing their flag, so they don't have to hide during the day to the extent that they can't show their flags, then the Ukrainian presence on the ground, the majority, can't be particularly large, so it seems likely that Seversk will fall soon. Southwest of there, in Sviatopokrovsk, there is also a geolocation. The Russians have advanced a little further west there. We recently had them here in this area. The Russians were here first, then the Ukrainians returned and pushed them back. Now they've advanced a bit further west, as always. Of course, this doesn't prove they've established themselves, just indicates a tendency. That was it towards Seversk. In the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians have been geolocated at numerous points near Ivanopilia. We have them here in the northeast of it, and then we have them in the center, here on the central road, if you will, and then we have them to the west of that. So again, this is not necessarily the final proof that Ivanopilia has fallen, but at least it seems as if the Russians are now operating everywhere in this area, basically east of the river. And that was the northern geolocation. Those were the others. So at the very least, Ivanopilia must now be considered fully contested. That the Ukrainians still solidly hold the northern part is extremely unlikely. That's it for now. I haven't noticed any changes from Kostiantynivka to Dobropyle. We continue on to Pokrovsk, and there we have further geolocation. We have the Russians here in the northern part of Pokrovsk, and we have Ukrainians in the center who are still there. And the interesting thing is that it's this house, which is marked in blue here. Directly north of it, there was a mechanized Russian attack, which at least suffered some losses. Whether it was completely repelled, I can't say for sure based on this, but we'll see. The Russians are now already operating with heavy equipment inside Pokrovsk, so they are undoubtedly making slow progress. We also have a geolocation from the east of Mirnograd. I think those were Ukrainians. Yes, those were Ukrainians. So Ukrainians who are still operating in the east of Mirnograd. The Ukrainians are maintaining their positions in Mirnograd more effectively than in Pokrovsk. But of course, it's clear that the position is at risk from Mirnograd. We can see here that the pro-Ukrainian deep state map now marks all the supply lines to the west as contested, as being in the grey zone. South of Svirov, we have another interesting development, and that's noticeably behind the front in the grey area. Here, the Free Russia Legion carried out a commando operation right in this area. In these rows of trees, Russian command posts and a Russian drone post were attacked. The Free Russia Legion has released video footage of it, and it reportedly happened without any losses on their side. However, the footage is probably somewhat older, so it's unclear exactly when this attack took place. But they probably operated behind the front against Russia and Russians there and attacked rear positions. That's it from the direction of Pokrovsky. We'll continue towards Mishova. There's nothing there. And towards Pokrovsky, we have the Russians. South of... Now we have to find Andreevka again. That's here. We have the Russians in Ostapivsky. There's a Russian soldier running around there, which means he would have crossed to the other side of the Yanchel River. We have that here. And then there's another recording, probably from this position, where presumably the same soldier is killed by a first-person view drone. That means, once again, the impression is given here that Ostapivsky has been taken, and then the soldier is killed shortly afterward. So that was, in all likelihood, just an infiltration. But of course, we always see these infiltrations, of course, show us that the front is significantly porous on the Ukrainian side. At least that's what can be concluded from this. Further south towards Huljapole, we have the Russians southeast of Dobropilya, advancing in the contested area right here. Here, this is the area in this forested region operating. In this one here, the Russians have been operating everywhere for some time, but especially near Huljapole. We have them in numerous new positions. We have them here in the east of the city. We have them in the center and also on the other side of the river. That was a crucial point which we already mentioned in the last situation report, that the Russians had managed to cross the river inside Huljapole, and with another in the north, Russians are advancing deeper into Huljapole. We have them up here somewhere, we have them here, and we already had them here as well. That's about how it is. This area is probably slowly being contested by the Russian side. Russian actions are making the Ukrainian position there increasingly difficult. At the same time, there are once again numerous accusations of perfidy from the Ukrainian side, claiming that Russian soldiers are operating in civilian clothing along the front. And that is undoubtedly perfidy, at least at the moment when they use it to act against the enemy. And by now, there are not only videos showing Russian soldiers in civilian clothing using their weapons. We also have footage from the Ukrainians where they capture prisoners of war wearing civilian clothing, all of which is a clear indication of Russian war crimes. Once again, from Orikhiv, we have Ukrainian soldiers taking Russian prisoners of war in Novodanylivka. This is geolocated here, so Russian soldiers were in the northern part of Novodanylivka. Again, this is not necessarily definitive. I mean, it proves that there were Russian soldiers there. Most likely it was an infiltration. The Russians are repeatedly spotted in these positions, whether it's in Malatov, Machka, or further west. I think the deep state map isn't accurate here, but as I said, we have geolocation from these areas, which, however, doesn't indicate permanent Russian positions. That's all from the front movement side. We still have something from Crimea that I forgot to show you. We'll do it quickly here now. And in fact, Fighter Bomber admitted it. There was a video which I also forgot, but I can show it to you. There we have a video of Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. We see, once again, drones are being attacked. Once again, radar systems are being attacked. And here we have an Antonov 26, an airplane. We can see that the propellers are rotating, so it's on the airfield and fueled up. And if we look at what Fighter Bomber writes here, he admits that it was hit because the report was that the pilots did not survive the attack since the plane was fully fueled and the crew was on board. And he more or less admits it here. What are they supposed to do? What are they doing? What is the crew doing on board the plane during a drone attack, etc.? That means Fighter Bomber is well connected among the Russian air forces and is one of the mill bloggers who admits losses. That means the Ukrainians destroyed a tactical transport aircraft along with its crew in Crimea with these attacks. Then we have something from the Black Sea. Specifically, the Russians hit a Turkish freighter in Odessa. Originally, there were reports that it was with an Iskander, but now there's a video showing that it was a Shahed attack. So here we see a Russian attack on civilian ships inside Odessa. When the Ukrainians started attacking Russian tankers, I said that it could be expected that the Russians would respond by attacking freighters. We now see this has begun. Obviously on the Ukrainian side, Did they take this into account, or do they accept that this is possible? We talked about this last time. In my humble and not exactly excessive opinion, based on my legal assessment, attacking oil or oil transport is justified by the laws of war, as oil should be considered contraband since Russia funds its war with it. Attacks on grain, legally both freighters are likely even more questionable. As I said, I'm still not a lawyer, but according to my humble understanding, the legal assessment doesn't necessarily have to be that way. That's because if some are allowed to do it, then others should be allowed to as well, but I'll leave the final assessment to others. Let's move on to troop generation, and there Ukraine says it has now deployed the Sapsan. That's the ballistic missile displayed at a parade before the war, likely just a mock-up then. And the Sapsan has a considerable range. We can see here an estimate of how far it could reach, and that includes Moscow, among other places. The Sapsan is a ballistic missile carrying nearly 500 kilograms of explosives. As a ballistic missile, it is extremely fast, and it flies so high that it can't be intercepted by most regular air defense systems, but only shortly before impact. That means it's somewhat comparable to the Iskander, which means if there is high-quality air defense on site, like the S-300 in some versions, S-400 or S-450 for example, or the S-350. Anyway, in any case, the Russians have air defense systems that are capable of shooting them down. However, as a rule, the air defense battery usually has to be relatively close to the attack site in order to have a relevant chance. Here, as with so many other systems, the big question will remain how many of them the Ukrainians can produce. If they can only manage to produce 2 of these missiles per year, of course, then it won't have any significant impact. However, if they manage to achieve a noteworthy serial production, then it will. Then it could become significantly more unpleasant for the Russians because the Ukrainians would have another weapon they could use in the rear area. We have more information from the political sphere regarding the peace negotiations. I could actually skip commenting on this, but then a few people would miss it since we've talked about it often enough. Russia repeatedly states Western troops in Ukraine are unacceptable. According to the latest plans, there is talk that there should be security guarantees. Europeans are considering sending peacekeeping troops. I have emphasized again and again that this is illusory, that Russia would have to be forced to do so. One of the reasons why Russia is attacking Ukraine is to keep NATO at a distance, to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. The moment NATO troops enter Ukraine to join as peacekeepers, it is an advance of NATO, a pushing forward of NATO, and basically a conditional accession of Ukraine, because the moment fighting breaks out, NATO troops are involved. And then, of course, Ukraine's accession would almost automatically follow. That means it would effectively be a defeat. From the Russian side, they would concede that NATO troops could be stationed in Ukraine. That doesn't mean it won't happen, just that the Russians must be forced, and we're still far from that. That means this point is obviously illusory. Russia announces that it would also attack foreign troops, claiming they would be legitimate military targets the moment they are deployed to Ukraine. And as long as the West is not willing to accept these attacks and is not prepared to endure or retaliate against them, in my view, deploying NATO troops to Ukraine is illusory. Similarly, Russia says that any confiscation of frozen assets will also be met with a response. That is also unacceptable. At least the European Union is now permanently freezing 210 billion euros that were confiscated from the Russian side, meaning Russian money was confiscated within the European Union. This will finance or secure 165 billion in reconstruction aid loans in order to support Ukraine in this way. So at least there is a freezing, but a direct transfer does not take place. Then there was the proposal to demilitarize the Donbass, and the Russians said that this was not to be rejected in principle. But police and Rosgvardia, that is the National Guard, would of course have to operate there for security. And of course it fits that the Rosgvardia, after the Wagner military revolt, was restructured to now receive heavy weapons. That means the Rosgvardia is now equipped with battle tanks and artillery. That means the Russians say we're not sending any military forces, we're only sending our paramilitaries who basically have similar training and similar equipment. That would make the whole thing absurd here, Lavrov. The foreign minister also emphasizes that practically all the points that would be significant, even in the originally pro-Russian 28-point plan, are still unacceptable, starting of course with the sovereignty of Ukraine, then moving on to NATO non-expansion, because those 28 points only stated that NATO would not expand further, but Russia wants it to be rolled back. That means they feel so powerful at the moment that they insist on it. From the Russian side, NATO should shrink again. European fighter jets in Poland are ruled out, as are security guarantees for Ukraine and even European Union governments for minorities. Because from my side, that was considered relatively unproblematic, at least with regard to Ukraine, because Ukraine wants to join the European Union, and in the European Union there are corresponding minority rights and appropriate minority protection. That way, Russian-speaking Ukrainians would be considered, but even that's not enough for the Russians. And we must not forget that the Russians are pretending as if a genocide is taking place against the so-called Russians in Ukraine. And at the same time, for example, we have this here. Here we have Russian media reporting that 7 Ukrainian children were adopted by a Russian family. Their child went to fight as a volunteer in the Ukraine war, on the Russian side, of course. And in the video, they explain that they raised their son to be a patriot, so he volunteered to go to war because he was not mobilized. How the children are then raised, the Ukrainian children, is of course predictable. They will be raised to be patriotic Russians, and that's what we keep seeing over and over again, that probably 30,000 or more Ukrainian children have been abducted and are being distributed throughout Russia. Some of them have already been handed over to Russian parents as adopted children, even though relatives in Ukraine are still alive who would normally, of course, take care of the children. It's clear the whole thing serves assimilation. The younger the child is, the more likely it can be raised as a Russian and will become a Russian and not, and lose their Ukrainian identity. And the attempt to erase identity according to the international definition is genocide. That means the Russians are basically accusing the Ukrainians of exactly what they themselves are currently trying to do. And that's it for the situation report at this point.